Hi, it's George from Any Old Music. Delineating a string quartet and string orchestra in the instrumentation and engraving of Elgar's Introduction and Allegro for strings impacts its composition, orchestration and arrangement. The reason is that it imposes a compelling dichotomy between a string quartet or solo strings and a string orchestra, sectional strings. A couple of weeks ago we looked at Vaughan Williams's Dives and Lazarus. In this article and video we investigated the blending of solo, divisi and sectional strings. Elgar uses similar effects in this piece, however the structuring and distinction of the two ensembles that I've just outlined, the string quartet and string orchestra, offer further ways and different methods into how we can think and write about the string orchestra. There are 3 lessons that I want to present here, taken from what Elgar does in Introduction and Allegro for strings. These are number 1, structural counterpointing, or the juxtaposition of musical sections between solo and section string timbres. Number 2 is the colouristic and numeric accenting of musical passages, which I'll explain obviously when we get there. Number 3 is the use of string quartet as a section in itself within the string orchestra. So number 1 then, structural counterpointing, solo versus section. The first lesson that I want to discuss here is the structural counterpointing between solo string instruments in the string quartet and sectional strings in the string orchestra. In other words, as the piece unfolds, we will hear a section that uses solo strings followed by a section for string orchestra, or vice versa, or alternating. The value of this is that we can hear with clarity the distinctive qualities between solo and section strings as they are laid barely before us to hear. There are several examples within Elgar's Introduction and Allegro for strings where one can see and hear this technique in action. The first, setting the tone of the piece, occurs close to the beginning, immediately after the emphatic Elgarian opening where all the strings play in unison parts. At rehearsal mark 1, highlighted in the annotated example on screen, we get a series of call and response interchanges between solo and string instruments. We also get some divisi techniques and string blending that's similar to that which we see, or have identified rather, the other week in Dives and Lazarus, RVW's piece. The same idea in this example appears in similar form throughout the piece, the motifs used in this extract being thematically significant. However, Elgar uses this same technique in different settings as well. For example, our second example at rehearsal marking 10, Elgar juxtaposes solo and section strings using quicker, measured tremolo figures. I particularly like these brief sections. It laid bare the timbral differences under a kind of different articulation to the first example between solo and sectional strings again. The distinction between these two timbres, solo and section, lies in what contemporary composer Rodney Sharman defines as presence and weight. In a fascinating 7-minute discussion that I'll link below on orchestration, Sharman discusses how orchestration has a 3-dimensionality that is not only based on spatial physical positioning, although that can obviously have an impact, but acoustic aspects related to instrumental voice numbers, dynamics, effects, and the register of a melodic or accompanimental line. In other words, depending on the instrumentation and orchestration, the presence or weight of particular notes can vary. Moreover, it is these things that allow us to play with this dimensionality as orchestrators. In Elgar's Introduction and Allegro for strings, the colouristic contrast between phrases is a numerical weight that leads to a difference in presence. I attempt to visualise this in the example on screen. With solid, incisive colours, the three solo instruments stand out. They are distinguished via the intensity of their sharper colours. In contrast, the sectional strings have a different presence. Less strident in colour, their presence is delivered via their weight, their size in numbers. Their colour is hued but given mass. Elgar, experimenting with this, juxtaposes incisive single voice lines with the weight of many. The result is an altered presence. While the sectional strings rumble steadily through the hall, one feels as though they are more distant, but that their momentum would be harder to stop. On the other hand, the solo strings have the speed and agility acting alone affords. Therefore, like a crack of lightning, they cut through the air with urgency and precision. Obviously, that might be a little dramatic, but it illustrates the point. Moving on to the second section then. This technique, which is numerical, accentuation and dovetailing, is similar to that of solo section blending in RVW's Dives and Lazarus. However, the way that Elgar deploys it here can expand our understanding and application of it. This is because Elgar uses the technique differently and in a more fragmented manner. The technique in Introduction and Allegro for Strings centres around the string quartet. However, Elgar also frequently pairs this ensemble with a section or divisi section. Elgar makes use of the technique in two ways. One of these is to accent or counterpoint a line, while the other is to tether two phrases or dovetail them. The technique, however, colours the melodic line or accompanimental line by altering their weight and presence. For example, if we take an example from Elgar that uses the effect to dovetail the melodic line, note how the melodic line in the first violins becomes a full section in the final bar of what is page 11 in this example, doubled by divisi celli. An altered repetition of the previous four bars, Elgar adds weight to the line and presence via the octave. The weight of the accompaniment is also increased. However, in further contrast to the previous four bars, Elgar uses the string quartet and divisi violins, first the seconds and then the first, to dovetail the phrasing. Given additional dynamic and articulation markings, they not only smooth the phrases, but they do so by adding subtle shifts of weight and colour. So how does this affect the colour or timbre? This form of doubling affects colouring in multiple ways, including presence and weight that we've discussed. The numeric addition and momentary subtraction between phrases where the sections obviously end their bowing and are ready to come in for the next phrase. On these particular notes, this will cause shifts in perceived depth. As we have discussed, solo instruments carry less weight but have a forwarded presence due to their incision. Therefore, in this example, we have a pair of shifts between weight and presence. At the moments of dovetailing the first violins and cellos, the weight increases. However, there will be a moment of sheen between the phrases as the sections break and the string quartet and divisi second violins continue sounding. As Rodney Sharman discusses in the video on writing for orchestra, we can play with space in a three-dimensional sense, and this is what happens here. Not only is there a numerical accenting via increased weight, but a forwarding of the sound through increased presence. The orchestration steps forward and then back, forward and then back again. The last example of string writing in this article is a direct result of the ensemble. Broken into a string quartet and string orchestra, this example pits the two against one another. However, in contrast to the first example, which involved juxtaposition, this one exhibits superimposition. Superimposition, at least my use of it here, is where the two ensembles are pitted against one another simultaneously. Juxtaposition, if you recall, is successive counterpointing of the ensembles. So if we had a phrase of the string quartet, the next one might counterpoint this by having the string orchestra play. In this instance, the string quartet plays a melody in octave unison, and the string orchestra provides an accompaniment texture. Already in an intense passage within the work, the accompaniment is polyphonic. The section, 5 bars before rehearsal mark 16, presents an 8-bar canon that morphs into a fugal imitative texture. An energetic subject with several distinctive motifs, we get fragments of ideas that wrestle for our attention. This polyphonic texture is sustained as the accompaniment, as the string quartet comes in with a legato, expressive melody at rehearsal mark 17. The orchestration creates the tension of this section. It is delicately balanced. Both string ensembles, their sounds being homogeneous. The orchestra could engulf the quartet if it wanted to at any moment. Even with the material being distinct, the melody, counterpoint and the accompaniment character. If the string orchestra was to increase in volume too much or change its material to be similar, the quartet would stand little chance of being heard. This is where the tension lies, in this delicate balance. Following this passage, the orchestration becomes even more complex as the ensemble's roles become more stratified. At rehearsal mark 18, the string quartet takes up a doubling at the unison. Creating a distinct timbre made up of two violins, viola and cello, the quartet counterpoints the ongoing polyphonic texture and fragments of lyrical melody. The roles shift and cycle between sections of the whole ensemble. For example, at rehearsal mark 18, while the quartet is in unison, the string sections of the orchestra are divided. The second violins play the polyphonic texture and counterpoint with a portion of the violas, and a portion of the cello section doubles the quartet. However, this changes 2 bars later. The quartet continues, but the second violins take up the lyrical melody, while the violas and cellos take up a semiquaver figure, a liquidation of the polyphonic texture, as it's in semiquavers. Another shift occurs again 2 bars later. The quartet takes up the lyrical melody in octaves, supported by a portion of the first violins. The second violins play what the quartet has just played. The semiquaver figure moves to the cellos and double basses. After this, the violas, cellos and basses take up the lyrical melody, while the quartet take up their initial idea, and the first violins get the semiquaver figure. The cycling of these ideas continues between parts and combinations of the ensemble. The dance-like play with space that Rodney Sharman highlights is played out here in Introduction and Allegro for strings quite intently. Varying levels of weight and presence gives the ideas colour through the sections. It also gives them planes of attention that creates variety between these cellular ideas that would be more difficult to pull off if thinking about the string orchestra as sections alone. Just as with Dives and Lazarus, I would recommend taking a listen and look at this piece. There is certainly more to be taken from it than I present here. For example, Elgar briefly but really coolly uses concertino and sul ponticello in this piece to reimagine one of the reoccurring melodies that often prepares for the return of an Allegro section. Sul ponticello is playing close to the bridge, which creates a glassy sound. I'll link some videos below, and concertino is playing with a mute. The other thing is to try and get these techniques into your works. The overriding strategy that could encourage this is to set up your score or digital audio workstation with separated solo, divisi and section strings. Doing so reduces the resistance to trying out ideas in these different combinations. Give the solo strings a unison feature within your larger orchestrations. If you've enjoyed this video, then subscribe, click the little bell icon, like and give us some feedback or questions below in the comment section. I've been George Marshall at Any Old Music. I hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.